understand. All right. So that means last week we talked about theory of process formations. The functional juggling and theory of process formations was class 2. So the idea with the theory, we're going to do a review of all this stuff, but the idea today is to look at the environments in which we want to apply juggling and how we can describe and talk about those interactions. So we came up with the relationships in the last class that we want to engage with, and then today is going to be about looking at the environments we can construct to facilitate those relationships and the language we use to talk about it. Class notes, today's structure is going to be review topics of last week and then presentation of new materials, and we'll have application activities and student-led assignments throughout. So you don't need a juggle board today, but what you do want to have is 5 pieces of paper with the numbers on them. Let me show you. I'm using Uno cards. But they're because when we're going to go over like the spatial sequencing maps, you just need a point of reference that you can put on the table in front of you just to reach out and contact, because we're going to talk about notation as well. So if you have just 5 pieces of paper with the numbers 1 through 5 on them, or if you have a deck of cards, those work as well. We just need the numbers 1 through 5. So have that ready, because we'll be doing some application of the notation. The intention of all classes of the entire project is to develop your awareness of teaching strategies through personal experience and application. And that although the material very much appears technical in its origin, it's important to remember that it's intended to be playful, organic, and fun, and that the learning is something that occurs in layers. So I can't guarantee, what everyone walks away with in terms of information. What I'm focused on, my quality control element, is making sure that you're able to do. Because there's different ways to understand it. And my way of explaining it isn't the only way to explain it. It's just how I happen to be able to communicate it. So the understanding part is less relevant always for me than the ability to do. And I think that's just to help. I think it's important to start the class here because it helps give reassurance. Not all of us need this reassurance, but I've been teaching a long time this material, and I find that it's helpful if we give this reassurance at the beginning. So nobody's stressed out if anything is over their head. We always have an assignment at the end, so if anyone's not understanding it, I'll be able to see in this moment. So don't worry. Previous topics that we talked about last week, we talked about the terminology functional juggling, which is something that we use to describe the intention of our juggling, not necessarily its design. And there has been some confusion. This is very new language. The term, I think, probably the first time we started using it was like 2016, 2017. And it was actually Lapo Buteri who came up with it. And then I think the idea is we need language to describe what we're talking about. But my concern is that we don't, with this term, I'm not as concerned in how you choose to use it. It's really general. I try to keep it really general, just to describe the intention. If we're using juggling for something other than juggling, it would make it a functional intention, right? So that's where I draw the line. When you get into the props and all these other material, this is more like specific to my brand, my particular methodology, and it's an approach. Quat props is the approach to functional juggling that I use and that I'm sharing with you. But there's other examples of functional juggling. This word could also be juggling therapy or something else. It's just you see this a lot in the therapeutic and the clinical worlds. They're always developing new language, and there's always ambiguity around the language as soon as it begins. Part of the reason it's so challenging, just a reflection point, the reasons it's so challenging to come up with terminology when we're working, trying to be inclusive, is because language is really bad at describing people who are different, without putting it in a negative context. So like disabilities, for example, terrible way to describe someone who's different. But how else can we talk about people who are special needs? Even is not considered to be really it's not, it takes away the humanity, right? So I find functional juggling is a way to kind of indicate that we're doing something a little bit different here, that we're being more accommodating for more people, but it doesn't in any way indicate that the person is lacking of anything, right? That's, I think, important, and you should be reflective on as well in your language if you're not someone who's worked in these communities as well. Try to put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself how you would feel if people used this language to talk about you. Um, Progressive adaptation, universal, the cause of its experience-based outcomes of global activation and flow state. I think this is other information. I think I'm supposed to take, I think I mixed up these points. I think this point here, universal to the cause of its experience-based outcomes. I don't think I should take that point out right here. But what I was getting at is just this idea that like juggling itself is representative now of a relationship, um, of the relationships that allows us to form and the state of mind that those relationships are known to trigger. Right? We know juggling produces a particular state of mind, which is similar to music, and we know that there's certain activities, there's a certain formula of interactions that is related to that state of mind as well. And this is where we gain our understanding of juggling, which is why it doesn't matter what the juggling looks like. So when people say the juggle board is like juggling, no, it's not like juggling, it is juggling. Like that's the point here. And this is the thing I want to make you aware of to avoid in your practice and to help other people understand as well. So that the same people who put juggling in a box to begin with, they don't put this idea in a box as well. We don't want any idea to be associated to any particular object or any particular action, because that's what causes it to be inaccessible. So if we think of these functional juggling apparatus, if we think of these spatial sequencing map designs as being things that are not juggling or similar to juggling, then we take that value away from the people who access juggling that way as well, right? Many of my students, they don't toss juggle. That's not something, a goal in their life, but they play with the juggle board and they are jugglers. So you understand that there's an importance that we make sure that society accepts these ideas, all these adaptations as equal representations of any expression of juggling, right? It's relative to the person. It's no longer based off your expectation. And then we introduced that. So then we after that we went to establish the theory, is where the theory begins. And today we're doing spatial sequencing map and prop swap. Okay. So yeah, so today it's last class. In this class, it really will encompass all of the theory. And then it's going to be the next classes will be about like applying it, the facilitation techniques of how we structure the juggling. So to begin with, we had to start with, understanding what the mechanic is that we're using to experience juggling. Like if juggling is an activity that occurs, it's an interaction between my body and space, right? In reality, I need to understand what my body is, how my body is interacting with space, and how I'm processing those interactions if I want to understand the state of mind that it's producing. And the key thing there, which I think is pretty common knowledge for most people, is that we have this bilateral nervous system, and that it communicates across a region of the brain called the corpus callosum. And this basic understanding, we're not really focused on the intricacies of this communication system. We're looking at like the basic map, the superhighways. What is the flow of information here? And this understanding with my nervous system and my brain lets me know that for me to have information about reality, for me to be conscious of reality, I have to take in information from it. And my body does that for me. It's designed to do that, but each side communicates to the opposite side of the brain. And then if either side wants to share information with the other, it has to communicate across the midline bilaterally through the corpus callosum as well. So understanding this pathway of information and then reflecting on the relationships that juggling allows us to form, we start to see, we start to analyze the amount of traffic that goes across. And that's how we create our new understanding for what the challenge of juggling is. Because previously we were using our external observation of it. Oh, the 3-ball cascade looks easier than a 4-ball fountain, so I will put that first, right? That's how we ended up there. But in this situation, we're not doing that. We're saying, what is the communication demand of this relationship? How does my what acrobatics does my brain have to perform in order to experience that or express that relationship? That's what we're focused on here now. And that's how we quantify the challenge. And that gives us a different indication. That tells us that synchronous lateral is easier than asynchronous bilateral because it requires less communication to be triggered bilaterally, which is an additional task. It's an additional challenge for the brain. So it gives us an understanding of how we communicate, and it gives us an understanding of how we're going to structure our hierarchy and understanding what is more challenging and what is less challenging. The three main conditions that any bilateral nervous system is required to process, no matter what they do, whether it's juggling or anything else, this is just for existence, is space, time, and signal. And for each of those conditions now, like there's obviously more conditions dependent on what you're doing, but I mean, as just for pure basic interaction with reality, these are the three primary. And because of the binary structure of our bilateral nervous system, we know that for each of these conditions that I have to process, my brain has to process, there can only be one of two outcomes, which is going to be lateral or bilateral. So if information arrives on one side of my brain, it can only leave in one of two directions, and based off which direction it leaves in, indicates a level of complexity, indicates a level of challenge. Information that goes in and comes out the same side is easier to regulate than information that has to cross over, because there's a lot of signals bouncing around inside your brain. There's a lot of electrical currents going on, and those signals can't interfere with each other as well. So when you ask it to cross over, you're asking for a lot more. And then we can deconstruct each of these conditions and understand which relationship is causing more bilateral signaling than the other. So we end up, for space we get synchronous, and we get lateral and bilateral. For time we get synchronous and asynchronous, and for signal we get associated and disassociated. And then this forms the basis of our behavior outcome goals for developing and teaching juggling. So we have a map now that's completely abstract. It's a map that doesn't say anything about action. It only talks about relationships between actions. And we're going to use this system now. We're going to apply this theory now to this concept of today, spatial sequencing maps. We're going to create an environment now in which we can focus on developing these relationships in their structured order. And then we're going to later on create compositions. But this is our goal now. We deconstructed this idea of juggling. It's not its action. It's representative of its relationships. Those relationships are an anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space-time. And now we have our structure. Now we know what it is we're teaching, and now we know what the steps are going to be. Last week, we also talked about static versus dynamic stimulation, which is the fourth component of our formula solution. So harmonized by space and time. This is the condition of juggling that is where we can start to deviate this definition from music and dance. It's how we harmonize with its sensory, whether we respond to sound, feedback of sound, or feedback of touch. And in the case of juggling, the harmonization that's occurring, the sensory feedback information we're required to harmonize with is actually space-time. And space-time is a really abstract thing. It can sound pretty heavy. Like you're like, hey, what the hell? I'm not even a juggler. Why are you talking about space-time? Because it's real, because we're surrounded in it. I'm sitting in it now. You're sitting in it now. We all know it's there, but we don't think about it. It's kind of abstract for us. One of the ways we are able to process this idea, because it is so abstract, is through our bodies. Our bodies are much better at understanding this information than our brains are. It really confuses our minds. Our bodies have no problem with it. And developing your body's ability to communicate this way with space, with its environment, is really healthy. It has a lot of positive impacts as well. But it's important to understand that it is an additional challenge level. And our whole goal in this whole seminar is to make the juggling accessible, to design an educational model that is inclusive for everyone. So identifying the challenge points and separating them, just like we do with each of the conditions of the theory of process formations. Okay, for time, I have two challenge levels, synchronous and asynchronous. Okay, for harmonization, I have two challenge levels, static and dynamic. I can choose to create an environment of juggling where I'm required to harmonize with external sensory information, and I can create an environment of juggling in which I do not. And in that situation, the static environments, we focus just on developing sequencing relationships. So the two main requirements to learn to juggle is twofold, right? We have two elements. First, it's developing the sequencer relationships is one element, the relationships with space and time. And then it's developing the harmonization of the sensory feedback information. And those are two different capacities. And understanding this, deconstructing the dynamic element of juggling and saying we can use that as part of our learning model. There's no reason static interactions cannot be used as part of a learning model for juggling, right? And in this sense, we really start to cross over. You can take a lot of inspiration now. You can take a lot of influence from dance education, because they do this structure all the time. They start with these sort of, I introduce to you the steps of a new dance. We go one movement at a time, and then you build up your tempo. It becomes more dynamic as we go. You learn to respond to the feedback information of music, whatever sound, whatever thing it is you're trying to cooperate with. Another cool thing about the static is that it allows us to extend our spectrum of our teaching model, but it also allows us to change directions. about our intentions as well, and where we're going, and what the purpose of juggling is. Because when we start to interact with static, we can incorporate any body movement we want and any object we want, which allows us to get a lot of time on task and repetition in short periods of time. And that's a value for cross-disciplinary, for outside applications, making partnerships with therapists and clinicians for intervention. So in this context, the static interactions, they really help us to make this transition where juggling is no longer the goal. It's no longer the outcome. Juggling is the platform to facilitate other outcomes. And this is so really static tends to be more when we're doing functional, and dynamic tends to be more when we're doing sensory development as well, or just stimulating the global activation more. Today's topics are going to be spatial sequencing maps, introduction and explanation of how to construct juggling environments through a system of playing with fixed points in space. So as I said, we know what relationships we want to encourage. Now we need an environment in which to apply them. And then that's going to produce a lot of material. And then later on, we want to start to construct choreographies as well, compositions, right? Music and juggling are very similar. We're going to be constructing compositions the same way we do there. And then, so that's going to require us to take a look at the notational language that we have, which is called prop swap notation. It's in the book. A lot of it is described in the book, so I'm not going to go super detailed into it. I'm going to go over all the parts so we're clear, and you'll have a practice exercise. But it's something that probably you're still going to need to look at the book for, and even something that I let people know, it's not super important that you learn that you're a master of notation. Like, the notation is there to communicate a certain amount of information. And then once you have that information, I encourage people to then figure out how to store it or consolidate it in whichever way their form of processing works best, So you might be more of a spatial person, a visual person. You can, make names for the patterns, whatever works for you. We're not married to the notation system. It's just there to help us share information. And then we're going to be looking at how to apply the notation and spatial sequencing maps. So experimenting with the creation of spatial sequencing maps and prop swap notation. So in last week's exercise, we played with a spatial sequencing map as well. We did functional movements, but we worked with only 4 points. And I didn't tell you about the spatial sequencing map at that point. Today, we're going to look at what the difference is, what happens when we start to work with 5 points, why that's important, and how to notate those experiences as well. This is my coffee break. Okay, so to begin with, our environment. We're gonna be using a concept that I refer to as spatial sequencing maps. This isn't sort of an original concept. I've observed this sort of teaching strategy in dance methodologies as well, but it's original to apply it in the context of juggling, to think about it that way. That part would be original. So spatial sequencing maps are intended to indicate where and when our interactions with space will occur, but do not determine anything about the manner in which they must be performed, right? This is a constant theme, a constant goal of ours, is to find ways to talk about, describe, understand juggling without relating it to a particular action. By describing our activity in this way as a spatial formula of its potential outcomes, we allow for the transformation of juggling's expression, while still preserving the most transferable outcomes of its benefits, global activation. So even in changing the activity this way and creating this structure, we're doing it for the purpose that we can have freedom of movement, right? We can choose our expression. But it's important to understand that this will not take away from the intention or the experience itself, right? Because the experience itself is related to a state of mind that is produced. And we talked about how that state of mind is relative to each person, right? Why juggling is like yoga and meditation. So we don't care about how you get there. We care about getting there. And this formula is going to allow us to do that. The freedom of transformation is what determines juggling to be one of the most accessible activities anyone could ever try to do. So in eliminating the need to talk about its action, we make it universal for everyone, because we're no longer required. If a person comes to me, I don't need to there's no particular action I need them to do. Any action can be used to create juggling. So any action that person is able to perform can be used to produce an experience of juggling, right? So juggling is the most accessible thing anyone could ever try to do in their life because it's already like customized and personalized to you as an individual. Whoever you are, there's a form of expression for juggling that is unique to you. That's what this means. To break down the concept, in general, for spatial, we make the maps themselves. The idea is to put points in space and then create a sequence of interactions with those points. Right, very similar to putting footsteps on the floor with numbers on them to learn a dance. Right, same idea, but with tossing objects or moving things around. Spatial sequencing maps can be made up of any number of points. However, the smallest amount needed to be able to stimulate our entire spectrum of binary relationships is 5. If you work with more than 5 points, you don't gain new sequencing relationships. You're just exercising the same ones in more complex structures. If you go less than 5 points, you start to lose some of the sequencing relationships, some of the sequencing potentials that we can form. So 5 is the Goldilocks zone. It's the sweet zone where we don't have to use more than this. It's the least complex structure we can have and still reach all the experiences. And then the way that it's laid out as well related to facilitation techniques and how we're going to be able to use the structure as well to communicate and guide. So to break down how it begins or how we end up at this situation is, you obviously we're going to start with having at least 2 points of contact, one on each side of the body, right? Because our intention is to create an environment that allows us to exercise and express the relationships of the theory of process formations, my synchronous lateral, my asynchronous lateral. Those are the types of interactions I want to encourage. So I need an environment with at least one contact point on either side of my body. And from here, we can begin to structure a lot of juggling activities. You actually only need 1 point. You need one contact point in space to create a juggling environment. But we're moving for a different goal to get all of them. So in addition to having 2 points on either side of the body, it's also really useful and necessary to have one in the midline as well to mark a separation between the two sides. And in terms of structuring different sequences and how we can encourage and transition people's behaviors from lateral to bilateral, having a point that is in the middle of the body to represent the midline is very useful because spatially the person we process the midpoint as being shared. So both hands are willing to go into that area, whereas the hands at the beginning maybe are not willing to cross over. They understand that that's not my space. That space belongs to the other side. So having the midpoint helps us a lot with this. Combination of these initial 3 points is enough to sequence majority of the interactions we have. So you can get a lot of sequences out of 3 points. A lot more, a surprising amount of sequences out of 3 points, but not all of them. For instance, you can't get both sides of the body to interact on one side, whereas you can in 5. So to achieve all the possible sequencing relationships, we need a total of 5 points. And most commonly, you tend to see, like in the example of the juggle board, an example of the Newton, and a lot of the props, you see a lot of representation of these points being arranged in a linear plane. So the reason that is for accessibility. It's going to be the least complex way to start to engage with these relationships. And it's going to be physically the most accessible because there's the least amount of obstructions. If there are points and things all over the place, depending on the person's body, you're creating more obstruction. So linear planes is a good way to introduce before visual complexity for accessibility, physical accessibility as well. But we're not limited. We're not limited to any access. We're not limited to working in one plane at a time. We can work in multiple planes simultaneously, and we can work along any axis. I would tend to do this. If you're going to do that, it's going to be obviously after you've played in a simpler form of environment, right? We always want to introduce ideas with the least amount of variables, with the least amount of obstacles and barriers. But there's nothing to stop you from being more creative, especially if you have the juggle boards where they come apart and the individual lanes. It's very easy where I can be doing activities with myself horizontally while exchanging objects with somebody else in front of me or behind me. Those open lanes really, let us start to structure a lot of interesting situations. So to give you an example, to highlight what that looks like, in the first one here is the x-axis. That's our most common facilitation position, what we call forward arrangement. And in that situation, I'm interacting with my spatial sequencing points along my x-axis. In the second example here, we have the abacus, which in this situation, all the points are in my midline. And I'm moving my hands up and down along my center point of interaction. And then on the y-axis, the hands are moving forward and backward, so away from me. We're learning about depth in this situation. It's a lot different to process, the points in space moving forward and backwards than it is side to side. These are different experiences, different stimulations. So it's nice to create a variation. It's good to understand like the challenge level. Okay, x-axis is probably where I'm going to start, and then from there I might go to z-axis or y-axis because those are going to be more challenging for people to process their spatial information. And then ultimately we can put them together however we want. So here's an example of the Newton. And this is a design by Mark that he's working on, and we were just talking about before class, like trying to develop that further. But in this situation, you have, if you were sitting in the center of that, you'd have different axes all around you, and you could be interacting as well. So the key thing here is the concept of spatial sequencing maps is it's more of an abstract idea. We can apply it in different ways. We're not limited to how we organize it. So to summarize that idea, the formula of the interaction is greater than the apparatus, right? And this goes back to the concept of functional juggling not being the props that we use to facilitate it, right? Functional juggling is the intention and the philosophy behind the juggling. So spatial sequencing maps, it's the same thing. It's the intention and the philosophy behind the apparatus. We don't want to be limited by any one apparatus, because if we are, we can't make juggling accessible for everyone. So the juggle board is one way to represent the concepts of a 5-point spatial sequencing map. However, it is not the only way we have to manifest such environments. Although we will be working exclusively with this device to model and develop our introductory understanding of the facilitation techniques. So, we're focused on it. In the training course, we focus on the juggle board because it's a great tool, but more so that we can learn how to interact with these ideas. So it's important to note that these concepts themselves are not exclusive to any apparatus, but rather intended to be transferable. And the key concept to this structure is just to have 2 sequencing points on either side of the body and 1 in the center, just to drive this idea home. We need a left-sided field of interaction, we need a right-sided field of interaction, and we need a neutral side field of interaction. So if you have those 3 ingredients, if you create an environment that has those 3 ingredients, that's an environment that you can apply the theory of process formations to. That's an environment where you can begin to stimulate and engage experiences of juggling. Practice exercise. So with 5 points of contact ordered along the x-axis, so I'd like you to create a spatial sequencing map for yourself, just like we did last week, but this time I want you to do it with 5 points. You don't need your numbers yet. So actually for this, the way it's going to work best is to pick 5 objects. 5 random objects or functional objects, right? And for this exercise, the only thing I'm going to ask you to do with those objects is just pick them up and put them down. Okay, we're not looking at, we're going to get into being more creative with the objects later. Right now, they're just reference points for us. So 5 objects, put them in a 5-point spatial sequencing map in front of you, and the action you're using is pick up and put down. We're not using any other action, okay? And with that action, to pick the object up, put it down, with 5 points now, I want you to search for as many different synchronous lateral patterns as you can find. There are many, and we're going to look at some. Some we favor more than others. But before I get into showing you all that material, I'd like you to take a moment now to explore on your own some of the different sequencing patterns you can find using synchronous lateral. And then also to remind us now about the theory of process formations, that any pattern you find synchronous lateral, you can do you can transform its formation. So for example, here's the synchronous lateral relationship, just to remind us here, if we have forgotten. And then the asynchronous lateral looks like this. And it looks like this is the relationship between the events, right? Synchronous bilateral, we need information to change sides. So objects have to be changing sides. And when we work with the spatial sequencing points, the way that we do that is we cross our arms, because those points don't change. So we change our position. So if you cross your arms, you're going to get the bilateral, and then asynchronous bilateral as well. So I'm going to pause these because they get a little bit distracted. But I want to pause them at a place where you can kind of get a sense of what's happening here. So this is a quick exercise, like maybe 5 minutes. Just explore some patterns. So say, okay, find different sequences of movements and then apply your theory of process formations to that. And then we want to be aware of like how much more material it is here. I want you to start looking on your own to see the potentials of this environment. So the idea of that experience, right? We haven't talked about the notation system yet, right? We just introduced the environment that we're going to play with. You can hear me, right? Yep. Everyone can hear me. So I wanted you to take a moment to explore that environment before I start to put all my structure onto it, right? So that you understand that there is more material there as well, and also to put in perspective for us to get a sense of appreciation for how much material is there. With just 5 sequencing points, there's a lot that we can do, and that material adds up really fast. And that's part of like the first intention of the notation is to help us consolidate all this information. We have so much material now, and to help us organize it. So we're gonna. This is sort of our motivation, part of our motivation for needing a notation system, because very quickly, how many patterns did you find? And for every pattern, it's times 4. Or really it's times 8, because we have 8 formations if you include disassociated, right? So it gets out of control really quickly. So the idea of prop swap is to create an ordered system of notation that allows us to describe the different sequencing activities of spatial sequencing maps. And I have to make a disclaimer here and also tell you about for the book, because the language here is still developing. And I made this mistake. Is my error. In the book, I refer to the prop swap as described in functional juggling. Prop swap does not describe functional juggling. It describes spatial sequencing maps. But even for me personally right now, there's a little bit of a blurry line between these things, which is why, so don't get confused there. But the notation describes sequencing maps, and sequencing maps are one tool of functional juggling. So just to clarify that. The notation system itself, it derives its influence, its grammatical influence from that of site swap notation, which is a mathematical language of juggling as well. It's another system that allows us to talk about juggling without describing its action, and it has had immeasurable impacts on our industry, our culture. Just the ability to share and communicate about juggling ideas without having language barriers was huge for us, and even to discover new ones. But the thing to understand, the important thing, is that prop swap is an invented language and site swap is a mathematical formula. It has principles. So you can't change site swap. If you change site swap, it doesn't work. If you change prop swap notation, it works. You can change these rules. You can come up with your own language. This is just an invented system for helping us to communicate. But in general, site swap does, because they're complementary systems. They are complementary systems. Site swap, it describes the order of events in time. And prop swap describes the order of events in space. So they're very complementary. And it's intended to create another universal language so that we can talk and share ideas and have access to more training tools. So the basic structure, it is a really simple structure. There's a lot of little rules we have to learn, little tiny things, but it's super simple. It's just complex because it has so many components. So the way that we start to create this notation structure is that we assign integers to each of the points within one of our spatial sequencing maps. And I can apply, if I have more points in my map, I use more numbers or more letters. The reason we use letters and numbers is to help indicate which position we are interacting in. So if I am using the forward arrangement, where I'm exchanging objects between another person and me, or moving away from me and forwards and backwards, I will use numbers. And if it's in the horizontal position, I'll use letters. And what this does is, from the beginning, it allows me to use the same notation system for both arrangements. So if you see letters, you know how you're playing. If you see numbers, you know how you're playing as well. And then we don't have to change any of the grammar. So that's really useful. So forward arrangement, we use letters. Forward arrangements, we use numbers, and horizontal, we use letters. And it's 1 through 5 and A through Z. This is the beginning. Thank you. The way that reading and writing works is it works the same as a timeline. It's very logical. The order that the numbers appear, or the order that the integer appears, is the order that I should interact with that location. So whatever order they appear is the same order that I interact with them. The important thing to understand, though, the one assumption, the law we have to make, is that the relationship of time always changes sides. So the default relationship with time is asynchronous, and it always changes sides. So if the first beat is left, the second beat is right. If the third beat is left, the fourth beat is right. So it should always go, time always goes left to right, left to right, left to right, left to right, or right to left, depending how you start. But the key element there is that we always assume the time changes sides. Every beat alternates from left to right. There's one other integer. I don't think it's in any of my resource materials as of yet, so you probably won't see it appear, but just for you to know and to be aware when you're creating your patterns, it's called for empty beats. So because we have this rule that time changes sides, it could occur that I want to use the same hand twice. And there are patterns. We can make games and activities where you use the same hand 2 times in a row. But for that, because the time changes sides, we need a way to indicate that I didn't use the other hand. And for that, we use a 0. So if you even if I don't use the hand, if I want the person to use the same hand twice, then I'll put a 0 to show an empty beat. I did not use that hand. The other hand took that turn, right? And it works the same in site swap as well. So 0s are used for that, but you won't see them so much. It's not in our composition. That's higher level material because a big part of being able to communicate all of our ideas and our facilitation technique is consistency. Consistent behavior is easier to communicate non-verbally than inconsistent behavior, right? So when you add in empty beats and you change the relationship of time, like left, left, right, right, that's inconsistent behavior, and that tends to require more verbal communication or higher level communication, right? You can do it non-verbally, but it's not going to be as accessible for everyone. So that's another reason why I sort of put this in another category, is because of the need. When I like to play these games as well with people, but only if they're able to understand verbal communication can I consistently, make sure that it works. But that's something to be aware of, empty beats. This is not a law of the notation, but it's something that's important for us to understand about it in terms of when we are evaluating our activities for our participants and understanding challenge levels. When we look at notations, the way to recognize different levels of challenge and give us a sense of what the activity will be like. So the period of a notation is how many integers it has before it repeats. So you can have an even number of periods or an odd number of periods, right? I can have a pattern that has 2 beats or 3 beats or 4 beats or 5 beats, right? The thing here to understand is that an even period notation, because it has an even number of beats and I have an even amount of sides to my body, whenever I have an even period, the objects will not change hands. The objects will not change locations. And it only has to repeat itself once. It only cycles once before it repeats again. Whereas with an odd period, because I have the imbalance ratio of my bilateral body, I end up having to cycle through the period twice before all the events, before the pattern completes. And what that means is that every object will change hands and that every hand will go to every location. So recognizing the difference in challenge between an even period pattern and an odd period pattern is important for us. It produces a different type of relationship. So in the structure here of the even period, we have our first example of 2, 3. And in this, the left hand starts off 2, the right hand is 3, and then it repeats left 2, right 3, left 2, right 3. The hands always stay in the same positions. They never change. When you get to the odd period, you see it's left 2, right 3, left 1, and then right 2, left 3, right 1. So in that sense, it takes 2 cycles for the period to complete, or two revolutions. And this will make more sense to you, I think, when we start applying and get into the composition. But it's something I just want to make you aware of right now, because otherwise it interrupts the other material. Okay, so that's out of the way. So the structure, now getting back to our start position. Start position is important. How do you know? If I see a notation, how do I know which side of my body I should start with? For this, we have a default. We have lateral. We always assume that the start position is lateral. So the side of the body that initiates a notation, the side that I should start with, is the side that's closest to the event. So for forward arrangements, we can divide our space very literally between left-sided and right-sided and neutral. So if a pattern begins with the number 4 or 2, I'm going to start with my left hand. If it begins with 3 or 5, I'll start with my right hand. And we never start a pattern with a 1 because it doesn't let us know which side the person's going to start on. You will find in our choreography, in our composition, a lot of the compositions are written left side to right side for the facilitator. That's because most people are right-handed, and that means they'll be able to start on their right hand because most people are going to want to start with their dominant hand. So if you roll someone who's right-handed, something on the left side of their body first, chances are they're going to reach across with their dominant hand. And now the whole pattern is confused and mixed up, right? So we want to encourage them to start lateral. That's our assumption. And as facilitators, we try to design to allow their dominant side to go first. So you're going to find more success that way as well. For horizontal positions, it's a little bit trickier or a little bit more complicated because you have a sequencing point for each side of the body. So for every sequencing point I have now, I have a contact on each side of my body, right? So for A, there's a left A and a right A, and B the same. So for this, we apply the rules. We know we start lateral, and then we always assume that the time alternates sides, right? So whether I start my first beat on my left or my right, it doesn't matter. It matters how I structure afterwards. So if I start on my right, then the next beat has to be on my left. If I start on my left, then the next beat has to be on my right. And I always assume I start lateral. So that's how we end up structuring that idea as well. Because it doesn't tell you how to start. Like for the horizontal position, we have to also set up where do the balls begin. In the forward arrangement, the balls are always start in the same place, right? Here we have to take responsibility to put them in their order. The next thing we need to do is look at the states of interactions that we're going to be working with. So there is no specified way to interact with functional juggling. So we're not talking about the action I use to produce my experience, but we're talking about the relationship of the orbit. What type of orbital event can I interact with? And because we need a different system of notation for each of those forms of interaction. And we categorize the order of these relationships as being either fixed state, open state, mixed state, or mixed state based on the dimensional parameters of their interaction. So each of these represent a different form of interaction, and each of these structures of interactions have different potentials or different limitations. And we're going to take a look at how we notate them and what the different impacts are. So to start with, we have fixed state. Is this video playing? And it's really basic. Fixed state interactions represent a form of relationship with orbital events in which their pathway through space is arranged directly in between 2 points. So this is more of what we would call an oscillation, but it's also an orbit, right? And it's this idea that if you have an object that moves back and forth between 2 points, that creates an orbital event for us to interact with. What's important to understand about this structure of interaction is because the object travels back in the same path that it leaves, I'm not able to work with more than one object per location, right? Because if I have more than one object in one location, they will interfere with each other, right? That's not true because now we have multiplex patterns, but in general. So this represents a fixed state interaction. An open state interaction is when the objects change their location. So when they move from one location to another. And in this situation, the important thing is that because the path that they return is not the same path that they go out, this was what allows us to structure multiple events per each location. So in this situation, I could be playing with 2, 4, 8, 10, any multiple of 2 I could play with here. We're not limited by the amount of objects that we play with when we start to interact with open state environments. And then just like with everything, all of our theories, we have this idea that we find one point, we find another point, and then we always have a point in between, right? So anytime we have 2 conditions, we can have a mixture of those conditions. And mixed state is what allows us to have disassociated. So in order to have disassociated, I need more than one type of movement. We have fixed state interactions and open state interactions. When you combine them, you end up with disassociated. These get really complicated to notate. But it works the same way. The principles are the same. But at that level of interaction, I even suggest that you not rely on the notation so much. You just try to figure out the patterns visually and spatially. But I will show you how that works. Okay, so now to look at the application of these rules. So those are the rules. Those are the things we need to remember. There's a bunch of little things. Like I said, it's a bunch of little ideas. None of them are that complicated, but we have to learn, to condition ourselves to be aware of them. So to start with, we're going to look at asynchronous lateral notation first. And we structure our notation now by its formation because that's what matters to us, right? So we begin with asynchronous lateral, and this is written just as a series of numbers, no grammar. If you just see a series of numbers, we know it's asynchronous and we know it's lateral, right? That's the default. Asynchronous notation is pronounced and read one digit at a time and not as a whole number. So in the first example of 2, 3, 4, 5, we pronounce it 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't say 2,345, right? I say it one number at a time. And you can see here, I think these diagrams make it very literal, very easy to understand, that the first beat is a 2 and it begins with the left hand. The second beat is a 3. It begins with the right. The third beat is a 4, you go left, and then 5 right. And then you repeat. So it's 2 left, 3 right, 4 left, 5 right. 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same idea for horizontal, but you can see in this example here, we have to decide how to set up the activity before we begin, right? So in this example, I decide to start with my left hand on the A, which means the second beat, the B, is going to be with my right side. And then the C will be with my left. And then in this arrangement, because every object changes hands, everything is bilateral, right? So then the pattern would go to the other side of the body as well. So you see here in the first beat, it's left hand A. In the fourth beat, it's right hand A. So it would always change sides because it's always bilateral. But in that situation, we notate bilateral, or we consider bilateral to be when we cross our midline. So it's already bilateral, but we consider that bilateral, the secondary bilateral condition, to be even more bilateral. For synchronous lateral, this is when we use the same action. When we do the two things at once, right? From the same time, both sides of our body simultaneously. And for this, we use parentheses, just like we do in site swap notation. And here we want to try to read, when it's numbers, we read it as a whole number. So in the first example, it's 23:45. And that's how you can hear the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. If I say to you 23:45, that's asynchronous. If I tell you 23:45, you know it's synchronous, right? And it works the same way. It's pretty literal. It's 23 is the first beat, 45 is the second beat, and then we go back 23, 45, 23, 45. When we work with letters, we're not able to do this consolidation because I can't really pronounce ab and sud. It doesn't make sense to do it that way. So what we try to do is just add a little pause in between. So if I was going to tell you to do this pattern asynchronous, I would pronounce like A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. But if I was going to say do it synchronous, I would say A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. Just to help if you're talking about the patterns, if you have to add that pause, otherwise it's not clear to the person who's listening to you, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, right? With the numbers, it's really obvious, but with the letters, you have to add a verbal pause. For asynchronous bilateral, the only thing we have to do is add an X at the beginning of the notation. And what that X is telling me to do is change my state of relationship with space. So the default relationship with space is lateral. If I see an X, it's telling me to change my relationship. So that's telling me if the 2 is coming in on my left side, it's telling me to use the other side. And by reversing, anytime you reverse the first beat of an asynchronous pattern, you reverse the spatial relationship of every beat afterwards. And that's why you see the period that comes after that X. It's to let you know that we only apply it once, or it applies to sort of the whole pattern. It's not something that repeats, because the period repeats itself. So in this situation, it would be X 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. It wouldn't be X 2, 3, 4, 5, X 2, 3, 4, 5, X 2, 3, 4, 5, because every X is telling me to change my relationship. So in the asynchronous version of bilateral, we only need to use one X, and that's why it appears that way. And then you would have crossing now on the first beat, and then crossing on the second beat, and crossing on the third beat, and crossing on the fourth beat. By inverting the first beat, every action becomes bilateral. And then for horizontal, we exercise this by reaching across the table to the other side. So that's like double bilateral now, because now you have every object changing hands, and you have every side of the body crossing over. So you get a lot of bilateral stimulation, a lot more there than you do when we do it in the forward arrangement. And then the last one to talk about is the synchronous bilateral notation, which is the one that gets people confused. So up until this point, most people are not confused. It's pretty literal, right? But the synchronous bilateral gets complicated because we need to be able to indicate which hand is on top of the other in addition to the location, right? Because I can cross my arms with my right hand on top or my left hand on top, and that makes a difference for my brain. So we have to look at those. Again, we're going to be using X's, so it imitates the synchronous lateral. So we're going to be using parentheses, and now we're going to be adding X's. There are several ways to structure this, depending on how often I want to cross my hands or uncross my hands or change the cross. There's a lot of different ways we can structure this. For the purpose of facilitation in our choreography, we use consistency consistency, the most consistent behavior is going to be the behavior that is the easiest to communicate when I'm working with people. So in that situation, the most consistent behavior we have is this one. It's when my arms are crossed in one direction and I fully move and cross them the other direction. And every beat, I do a full change in. That's the most complex in terms of sequencing, in terms of how I could structure this type of interaction, but it's the most consistent. So it's the easiest to communicate. It's not that much more complicated than the others, but sometimes people point that out and they say, why do you use this movement when you could structure this way and it would be easier? And my answer to that is communication. The less consistent the pattern of behavior is, the harder it is to communicate. So if you don't understand the notation, if the notation appears really complicated for you in this next slide, as long as you condition yourself to recognize the symbol means this action. So just do this action right now for me real quickly, just so we are all on the same page. So you cross and then you change. That's the behavior. When you see the notation, don't try to deconstruct it so much. Just see it as a symbol that tells you to move that way. If you think that way, it's going to be a lot easier. Because the way that it works is the X at the beginning of the notation tells me to cross my relationship, and then the second X tells me to uncross. So if we get into this notation here, you can see in the first example, it's X23X followed by X54X. So in the first one here, you have X23X, and the order of the numbers now is letting me know which hand is on top. So because the 2 comes first, that's the hand that is on top. So you see here, the 2 is in the top position and it's highlighted yellow. And then in the second beat now, we reverse these numbers. Normally, when it's lateral, we write 2345. But when it's bilateral, we write 2354. Because on the second beat, it's the 5 position that the arm should be on top, and that's the left hand. So it's going from right hand on top to left hand on top, right hand on top to left hand on top. And that's why we use this reversing or this changing of order of the numbers. The order of the number lets me know the order of the position of the hands. The first number is on top. Because if I wrote X23X, X23 again, then that would tell me to continue to cross with the same hand on top. And in some situations, maybe you want to be doing that, but most of the times, no. You know, that's like when you see, I give the comparison with poi, beginner poi students, when they first start to do the 3-beat pattern, the 3-beat weave for the first time, they cross on overhand on one side of the body, but they don't cross on the other, right? They'll go open on one side and then they'll cross on the other. So we want to make sure that they can cross on both sides of their body. That's really important for us. And that's why we use this reordering of the hand positions. And again, it works the same way for synchronous bilateral. And you can see it's the right hand that's on top, followed by the left hand that's on top. I know that visually this part of the notation looks the most complicated, which is why I am stressing to you, just make an association right now with those symbols and this behavior. Just associate the symbols to this pattern of behavior, because in majority of the facilitations you do, and in our composition, that's the only pattern of behavior you need to know. Cool. And to give a visualization of that, and we do use this structure in the notation as well, is that if I were to write X23, you see that means that my right hand is on top and it's in the 2 position, versus X32, where my left hand would be on top and in the 3 position. This is not that important. I'm sharing with you because this is how it works. And if we want to be accurate, this is the information I have for you. But especially on the synchronous bilateral, I tell people, like, don't take it too seriously. If you want to, and you really want to write it, correctly, this is the information for you. But it's not required. It's not needed. What's needed is that you can use this language to communicate these ideas, right? That's the important part. So now we're going to have a writing exercise. So if you could get a piece of paper now, and you could start to write down, make yourself this little chart, or probably it's easier not to do it in this chart, but just to do it one line at a time. But this is going to be a writing exercise for you to show you how the theory works. So you had the opportunity to explore different patterns with a 5-point spatial sequencing map on your own. And chances are you probably found some of the patterns that I'm about to show you. These patterns that we're using, these are the patterns that we use in our primary composition. They are not the only patterns, but they are chosen for specific reasons to develop and encourage certain behaviors, right? Each pattern is going to represent a slightly different relationship for how the person is required to process spatial information. They're all slightly different in certain ways, whether they're causing information to be crossing bilateral because of space or because of objects or because of location. It all makes a difference. And then the idea is then by identifying these different relationships that the patterns allow us to create, we can then apply our transformations of the theory of process formations to look at all the material we have. So you're going to start to get really familiar with these 4 patterns. We're going to look at them, their structure later on, but these patterns now, you can start to learn them by their number as well. It's something that's going to help you consolidate these ideas, because I don't think about notation when I facilitate. I think about pattern and formation. I say, okay, do pattern 1 synchronous bilateral. I know what that means. I know that that's x23x, x54x. I don't need the notation anymore. That's what I mean about consolidating the information, because that's going to help you when you're thinking about it based off its capacity, because these pattern numbers are also ordered in relationship to their challenge. So we have a graph now. Pattern 1 synchronous lateral is the easiest stimulation I can offer, and then pattern 4 asynchronous bilateral is going to be the most complex. This gives you a map that you can walk through incrementally, add in the smallest amount of incremental challenge at a time. That's the beauty of this. Sorry to get excited for a moment about it. I'm really, really grateful for this tool. So I want to communicate my excitement. But the exercise now itself is, if you look at it, it's really simple. The first pattern 1 is our example. So you can look at pattern 1, you can say, okay, synchronous lateral is our base. We call it our base formation because it's where we start. So synchronous lateral is always our base. And 23, 45. So if I wanted to go from 23 to 45, I want to make an asynchronous lateral. How do I write that? I just take away the parentheses. It's really simple. I write the same order of numbers without parentheses. And then if I wanted to make it synchronous bilateral, I would put the parentheses back. I would add X's. And the second number, I would reverse the order. Right? You see that? 23, 54. And then for asynchronous bilateral, it's the same as asynchronous lateral. I just add an X and a period before it. So this is actually like super simple. Like, don't overcomplicate it. It's that literal. So what I would like you to do now is to look at the base notation, the synchronous lateral for patterns 2, 3, and 4. I want you to write out the asynchronous lateral, the synchronous bilateral, and the asynchronous bilateral, right? And if you have a little bit of time, because this is going to take everyone a different amount of time, if you have a little bit of time at the end, try to tap out those patterns with your spatial sequencing points. So you can put the numbers in front of you now. You have those 5 objects. Now put the numbers in front of those objects. And you can use that as a reference. So if you have additional time at the end, if you finish early, try to practice some of them as well. Everyone's free to learn in their way. But let's take a look at these, right? So again, I think it's something where it's a lot of little pieces of information, new information, but when you actually apply it, it's really simple in its application. So for pattern 2, we'll look at first, and you can review and see. I think it's really helpful, to try and then reflect. So I think it's pretty obvious. For pattern 2 synchronous lateral, we have 23, 41, 23, 15. So then the asynchronous version would just be 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 5, right? So if I had 23, 41, 23, 15, then I have 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 5. And then I can also have x23, x, x14, x, x23, x, x51, x. And then you have the last one, which is the same as the asynchronous lateral, but we just put an x in front of it. And in this way, too, you can start to see a pattern or structure emerge, right? The beautiful part, or what's really helpful for us in structuring our learning models this way, is because the synchronous lateral, that helps us establish the conditioning behavior that we want them to have with space. So we're able to use the structure to condition behavior and build on top of that conditioning. So if I can condition you to have an association with certain movements to certain locations in space first, now I have this behavior, then I can transition that behavior to asynchronous, right? And I can do it with an understanding that I'm with an awareness of how much more I'm asking you to process, an awareness of how much I'm asking you to transition your behavior. And that's what really helps us, especially when we get into our choreographies. It's using that same structure: condition relationships with space, transition relationships with time, condition new relationships with space, transition new relationships with time. It's that same structure for every learning model now. For pattern 3, we have the synchronous lateral is 4325. And then for asynchronous lateral, we remove the parentheses, 4, 3, 2, 5. For synchronous bilateral, the parentheses come back. We put the X's before and after each number, and we reverse the second number. So it's 43, 52, right? As opposed to 43, 25. And the only thing that's telling us is the order of the hands. And then for asynchronous bilateral, X, 4, 3, 2, 5. For pattern four is interesting because if you had the chance to tap this out, what you may have noticed is that this is a pattern that requires you to cross your midline, because 42 requires both hands on one side of my body and 35 requires both hands on the other. So technically, this pattern is always bilateral as well because we have that crossing of the midline. But something you're going to observe when you start to facilitate this pattern that we observe often is that people have a tendency to shift their weight from side to side because they prefer to change their orientation of midline rather than actually cross it. So even though pattern 4, it has it's a little bit of a hybrid pattern 4, and we use it a lot when we are trying to transition the person's behavior to be more bilateral. Yeah, I'm not going to go over that because it's pretty obvious there. But what I want to show you is this sort of like color scale to give you an indication of like what this type of concept allows us to do with our learning models as well. So as we said, like once we have our patterns and if we can analyze a structure of complexity in our patterns, the activities, the sequence and activities themselves, then we can order them in a hierarchy. Like, okay, this one's more complex than this one. And then we know the complexity of the formations. So we apply those transformations and we end up with something where pattern 1, synchronous lateral, becomes the activity that I can begin with. And then pattern 4, asynchronous bilateral, can be an activity that I should end with. So, and it's not literal, right? Like it's going to be applied in different ways, but this has given us a new way to evaluate what we're presenting and where, when I'm having a student that's struggling, it gives me an indication of what areas I can go to that are around that challenge, you know, that are going to require similar amounts of bilateral communication signals. So this is what this chart gives us as well. And you can apply this to anything, to other disciplines. This whole concept of the theory of process formations, if you wanted to apply this to acrobatics or, you know, different things, you could have synchronous lateral jumping with 2 feet, you know, and then asynchronous lateral. And you can set up different, you know, whatever your motor control is, come up with different challenges of those motor controls, apply the theory of process formations, right? And you'll come up with models that work the same way. So you should have your numbers in front of you, right? So you have your objects, and in front of each object, you have your numbers, right? So you have your spatial sequencing map, and it's labeled. For these exercises, you can choose to interact with your objects. I suggest just touching the numbers because this is really about understanding the structure. So you can follow along now as we're talking. This is where I'm gonna analyze the pattern structures for you, so you can get an understanding for what each pattern is exposing us to, and why we order it the way that we do. And then you can have a chance to tap out some of these notations as we talk. So just have your numbers ready in front of you and tap out as we're talking. So to begin with, pattern 1. Pattern 1 is the simplest structure of interaction because it's reflected. The symmetry, it's reflected on both sides. So in this situation, the hands are moving towards each other and away from each other. The images are reversible. And that means it allows the information to be consolidated. It's the easiest way to consolidate all the information. So we start with pattern 1. And then these are our variations of it as well. So if you can do the first version here, you see 2345. And look, and focus now on the structure, the relationship between each side of the body, how each side of the body is moving in relationship to the other, right? And then we do the same thing, same pattern, same locations, same order, but asynchronous. And then same locations again, same order, but synchronous bilateral. We only change the relationship of the formation. That's what this system allows us to do. To really structure and organize all of our material based off of its the type of spatial information it's asking me to process and the type of formation I'm forming with that information as well. For pattern 2, 2341, 2315, try tapping that out really quickly for yourselves. And notice as you're tapping that, notice that the one position alternates between the right hand and the left hand, right? So when it's 41, it's the right hand that touches the midline. And when it's 15, it's the left hand that touches the midline. Pattern 2 is intended to start to encourage this behavior. If we want to get the person to cross their midline, we have to get them to share their midline, right? So the idea of pattern 2 is to encourage contact, alternating contact with the midline. Another thing about its structure is important to understand is the distance between hands never changes. And when you do that type of relationship, that sort of isolation, that's requiring more communication of spatial information to be communicated, because they're constantly having to check in about their positions in space, right? In order for me to create this illusion with my body that there's a fixed distance between my hands, they are constantly communicating about their positions, right? Whereas if the position in space the distance is changing, then the equation is different as well. So in this situation, you have two new conditions, which is the distance stays the same between hands, which is causing more communication, and we are encouraging sharing contact of the midline. That's what pattern 2 introduces. And then you see we have the bilateral. Another thing about this structure, when we start to apply to the composition, is the asynchronous bilateral versions of a lot of these patterns are super complicated. And you can imagine if you had to explain to someone verbally, like to do this pattern from the beginning, it would be very hard. But because we have this structure, this entry point of synchronous lateral, where everyone can comprehend the pattern, and then we can transition the behavior. It's why we're able to get such complicated movements from our participants without having to explain, because it follows sort of an intuitive development, where each new development conditions or reinforces the next one, right? For pattern 3, this is where we introduce the idea of asymmetric symmetry. So we talked about with spatial conditions, we have 3 ways to trigger that bilateral communication signal. The first one is having the objects change sides. The second is having my body change sides to cross my midline. And the third is when I work with spatial information that is asymmetrically reflected over time. So something that has an imbalance, but it's reflected in both directions, because then the brain tends to reverse those images. It starts to reflect those images. So it's communicating a lot of visual information, which is another stimulation, another type of bilateral communication about space. And the way that pattern 3 works is it's similar to pattern 2 because the distance between hands never changes. It's always the same distance, which is encouraging more communication. But here it has an asymmetry. It's biased to one side, then biased to the other, right? And in that situation, that's going to cause the brain to try to reverse those images. It's really small, it's really subtle, but now we're starting to see the application of all these relationships, right? And how we're really trying to get in between all the cracks of what are the formations and what are all the different situations that my body can engage with those formations. Really deconstructing all the challenge levels. Tap those out. And then what else can I say about pattern 3? Pattern 3 is very similar to pattern 2, right? Look at this from the beginning. Really similar to pattern 3. It's a subtle difference, right? The difference is that the hands are now stay in the same distance apart, and they're not reflective of each other, right? They're asymmetrically reflective. And when you do it asynchronous as well, it looks very similar to pattern 2. But there is a very subtle difference in how you process the information, and we're trying to expose a wide spectrum, a wide variety of processing and sequencing challenge, not just the 3-ball cascade, right? We don't look at juggling as being one relationship. Juggling represents all of these relationships, so we need to try to expose to as many as we can here. And then with pattern 4, as I said, this is where technically you get into bilateral, because here you see one side is crossing the midline. But when we facilitate this pattern and you're doing synchronous lateral, most people will tend to rock back and forth with their body or shift their shoulders from side to side, or even just change their gaze of their eyes or the direction of their head, because they're projecting, they're shifting their midline so that they don't necessarily, it's not authentically crossing the midline. When you get to asynchronous, then you are crossing the midline. But it's a subtle, it's a baby cross, right? We went from going to touching the 1 to touching the 2, and from touching the 1 to touching the 3. So it's a nice pattern that helps us start to introduce that idea of crossing the midline, because it does give people that ability to change their position in space. So some people who need a little bit more conditioning first, they can do that, and they do it naturally on their own. Whereas someone who doesn't need that, they can process this as well too, right? So pattern 4 is intended to be sort of helpful for everyone. There is one other pattern that we need to introduce that we didn't introduce in that written exercise, because it doesn't conform to all formations. And this is a category. This is more a category of patterns that we group together based off the type of interaction that it represents. They're not actually grouped together by the structure, the order of their relationships in space. They're grouped together because they represent a series of patterns that require me to express and process multiple formations within one sequence and activity. So not just to process, the idea is to break down and isolate each formation separately and develop its capacity to focus on synchronous lateral relationships, then asynchronous lateral, and develop up this way. Pattern 5 category is when we start to ask the person to apply it more like a language, to say, okay, you have this vocabulary, now speak with this, interchange, use different words to create different meanings, right? It's this idea. It's the applied application of all the relationships. That's what pattern 5 represents. Pattern 5 is always going to be an odd period because it means every object's going to change hands. It means each side of the body will go to each location, and it's going to provide the most amount of bilateral communication as well. This group of patterns can be similar to like Mills mess, right? We talked about here. So for the first example, this is the one we use in our composition, is 4-2-1-3-5. We also, a lot of people, I refer to this as the typewriter. It's like a name I gave it because it works like a typewriter. It goes left to right. Ding, ding. Notice here though, or let me go back to that example from the beginning here. The important thing to notice, I told you about the difference between even period and odd periods. Here, the 4 is lateral on the first time. The second time, it's bilateral. So notice the start position, 4 lateral, 5 beats later, 4 bilateral, right? So be very aware of that, because a really common error when we start to facilitate these patterns is the person will sequence it correctly the first time through, and then they'll always start with the same hand. So they'll do left, right, left, right, left, left, right, left, right, left, left. They always start from the same position when they should be alternating positions. And I have 4 variations of these. There are many more. If you pick any, if you randomly call out order of these numbers in any arrangement, all 5, you'll get some variation of pattern 5, right? You'll get some variation that requires you to sequence 10 beats before you finish, and it's going to have every object change hands and every side of the body go to every position. So this is the benefit of pattern 5. And it doesn't fit into any single formation because it represents multiple formations. And that's really the application of our development strategy, right? So we use this development strategy of deconstructing the relationships to build up. So the person, okay, now you've experienced each of them separately. Okay, how do we apply that? How do we evaluate our proficiency with that? Give the person the opportunity to speak it, to interchange, right? Now it's the difference between like making a sound and making music, Like we use sound to make music, but it's not the same thing. For the open state notation, I'm not going to go into like now the structure. I'm not going to repeat. So that first part we looked at forward, fixed state, and horizontal. The open state now it works the same way, and it is in the book, and it's explained all the way in the book here. I'm just going to give you examples here to see how we apply for each condition. So we're only going to look at the pattern 1. And something to say about open state patterns as well is here you end up with less material. There are less patterns here. But what this arrangement allows us to do is add more objects. So with fixed state, we're usually focused on developing the sequencing relationships. And then with open state, we're focused on challenging those relationships by having the person work with more objects in less time. So in this first example here, we refer to pattern 1 based off the structure of its relationship. So even though this looks different than the other pattern 1, this is still pattern 1, because if you look at the movement of the hands and how they move in relationship to each other, it's the same structure. To reiterate, for open state, we use brackets instead of parentheses, and we have a number that indicates where the object begins and where the object goes. So the first number is going to tell me where the object should arrive, and the second number is going to tell me where it goes. As a facilitator, when I'm using this notation, I tend to focus only on the second set of number because that's the number that affects me. I don't have to worry about the ball's arrival. That's the other person's job. So if I'm in the first example, I'd just be thinking 45. I take the balls, I send them down the 45, and then I send it down the 4, I send it down the 5, and then I do the same thing but bilateral. Let's watch that video again here. just to get it in your head. But you can see it's the same way, and I would read this 23 to 45. And you can use any amount of objects for this, even or odd. So I can do this with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. If you use an odd number, you're going to get different tempos on either side of the body. It's going to be weird. So for this structure, I would recommend using even numbers. But then we do have other patterns where the participant only has one lane. If you've read the book, if you've seen some of the notation, we have like patterns that are like 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 3. And in that situation, the student only has the center lane, and then you can use odd number balls. But we can apply the same concept here. We can identify a pattern. We can find one structure of interaction, and then we can apply the transformations of the theory of process formations, right? We can develop that particular sequencing relationship with all the different potentials that we can do. And then for horizontal, it works the same way as well, but now we're looking at letters. So I think visually, just to drive this home now, we have A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. And then for asynchronous, it's going to be A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C. For open state, it's going to be the first letters tell you where the balls start, the second ones tell you where they go. In this situation, you are responsible for both locations. So it's AB to BA, CD to DC. And you notice the order of the letters reflects the order of the hands, right? Because the A is on the left, and then it's AB to BA, right? I'm just changing the order of them. I'm not, they're staying in the same two lanes, but they change their order. So it goes from being A, B to BA, because the B is on the left now and the A is on the right versus, do you want to watch one more time real quick? I think the open state more. Let's just take a look at that open state again. So it's just AB to BA, and the order of the letters there, it's doing that. It's this consistency of having the order of the numbers of the letters reflect the position of the hands in space as well, right? So I always write it left to right, left to right. And again, when you get to like open state horizontal, another thing too, I would find is a lot of people develop that material without notation because it starts to get really complicated. And the notation does have a limit. It gets to a point of the activity gets to a point of complexity where it's like you have to start creating with your own imagination, or the notation just makes it more complicated, right? The notation starts to become irrelevant once it's more complicated than learning it in a different way. It's only helpful to us when it's the faster way to learn something. But there are many ways to learn the idea. Okay. So now is our playtime exercise for you guys to apply this concept. So you have your 5 objects in front of you, and what I want you to choose now. You have the freedom to be creative with those objects. So just like this exercise I had you do before, where you only pick them up and put them down, I want you to do the same thing now to come up with sequences. You can use the pattern numbers that I showed you, but the idea is for you to come up with your own little mini choreography. So you put together a series of tricks. I don't know, 3 or 5 patterns. You want to put those together. You're free to explore with this idea. And then the key goal here is that you're able to notate that activity. So you're going to come up with your own little choreography of sequences with a 5-point spatial sequencing map, and then you're going to notate it. If you want to, as a bonus, because there's a lot of things I'm asking you to apply at the same time right now. A lot of new things, information at the same time I'm asking you to apply. The spatial sequencing maps, the patterns, the notation. So then as a bonus, because we always want to keep in mind that when we are working with functional objects, we have that potential to be creative, right? To be narrative, to be play-based. So focus more on your patterns and your choreography and be reflective of like why you would want to use those patterns, I want to encourage this type of relationship, focus more on the patterns that you're doing and being able to notate those choreographies. But as a bonus, if you're feeling it today, always bring that other play level to the table, figure out, like we talked about last week, it was more about we used 4 points, but we were focused on the functionality of the game. Oh, how can I use this objects in a functional, playful way? I'm letting you know, like, do that as well today, but super optional because that's a lot of things to process in a 15-minute exercise, right? But the basic idea is to create your own choreography. I'm going to go back to the slide that has the notation for you. So I'll leave the slide with those 16 patterns up. You're free to use any of that material or to discover and play with your own. But the idea is 5-point spatial sequencing map, 5 objects of functional interaction, notate your composition, and then we will share. Sound good? Great place to finish. Thank you. And now we will do our summary. So I'll go back to the screen share. We'll do a quick summary. I have 4 minutes to do this. Maybe I go a couple minutes over, but the summary is pretty quick. It's really there's a lot of repetition. I think there are a lot of ideas that we're talking about, but I try to really consolidate the ideas and be more repetitive with them, so that you walk away with sort of like the key elements. But I throw a lot of information at you. Okay, so the idea with the spatial sequencing maps, all of us get this now. It's really simple. I think we don't have to make it so. It's not even that revolutionary. Like, it's really, we're copying this idea is something that comes from dance instruction. We see this in dance instruction all the time, creating spatial contact points that I'm going to interact with, and then creating a sequence with those points. If you put a spatial sequencing map on the floor, it's the same idea. Put points on the floor, add numbers to them, and then start calling out numbers, right? It's like that. Or even Twister. This board game Twister works this way as well. It's imposing spatial context to create an environment that we can explore these relationships. Any number of points is okay. You can use more than 5 or less than 5. The important thing to understand with 5 is the structure of it. How it's important that we have a balance, symmetry, right? That we have 1 point in the middle and equal amounts of points either side. Because, like as Mark pointed out, if you don't have an equal amount of points for either side, people distort their relationship with the midline, right? If you put points in front of me, it's up to me to decide how I project my midline. So by adding a 1 in the middle, it helps enforce that idea for them. And 5 is good because that's when we can get the entire spectrum of our sequencing relationships, different formulas of patterns. More than 5, we don't get more material. We just get more complexity of that material. Less than 5, we begin to lose materials. So 5 is a really good place to work with. The other thing is these points don't have to be arranged linear. We played with them today linear, but you can put them at different heights. You could be working with a bookshelf, and these points are going up and down, forward and back. You can just surround a person with points of interaction and apply this system to that, to those points of interaction. And then we spent a lot of time talking about the notation, which I know it's like numbers and letters and rules, and and I'm someone who likes to play, so I understand this material is dense. The only thing I can do is just emphasize to you the importance of understanding it, in terms of how it will allow you to access the compositions, the choreographies that we share with other people. But maybe that's not a value for you, and maybe that's not relevant in your practice. So again, to let you know that it's okay to change this system, to come up with your own system. This is the one that we use, internationally to help us share ideas. And then removing the need to describe juggling by its action allows for universal transformation and accessibility for everyone. So I told you at the beginning of class, at the end of this course, today's class, we sort of, between last week and this week, we introduced our theory for construction. We now have a means to describe juggling, to notate that those interactions, to structure a hierarchy of development within those interactions. And all of those systems, none of them require me to describe the actual action, the expression itself, right? Because I have the formula solution, which is a managed anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space and time, something that describes and gives a context to what I'm doing without its action. I have the theory of process formations, which gives me the 8 possible relationships that I can explore, another way to describe juggling without describing its action. And we have spatial sequencing maps, where we can apply those relationships, another way to describe juggling without talking about its action, and prop swap notation. So we have 4 ways to talk about juggling now that don't relate to its action. And that's going to create the foundation of our approach, how we make it accessible. When you come back tomorrow, we're going to look at the primary composition, which is a choreography that we design. It's the application of the theory of process formation. So it's a very efficient and studied development plan. And we're going to look at how we apply that plan, and we're going to start to talk about facilitation techniques. Because having this solution now we have our solution, right? And this is the world. This is how it works. You can have a solution, but the application of that solution is another story, right? That's another set of solutions that we need to come up with. Because if I have an idea that I know is going to benefit you, That's only the first step. The second step is being able to communicate those ideas with you as well. That ends up being our final barrier. So we have the solution for juggling's accessibility now. Now we need to look at the barriers about communication and transmitting that information. And that's what we're going to do next week. And your homework should be to read chapter 17, which is the primary composition. And then during a moment when you are sharing a meal with family or friends, try to structure a system of a 5-point spatial sequencing map using the objects that are on the table. So just like this activity we did in the classroom today, but I would like it if you could try to find a moment. I mean, it doesn't have to be at a dinner table. It doesn't have to be while you're eating, but I find that like a kitchen table, if you're eating at a table with people, it's just, there's so many objects on the table to play with. So it's like very easy. And what I want you to try to do if you do this is to focus on your ability to get people to do these different patterns, to communicate to them these patterns without explaining to them what you're doing. And to catch them by surprise, because I want you to try to see just, your communication ability now with this. So, take your compositions that you have now, or just, doesn't have to be so formal. Just, if you can, I really suggest this. Try to take a moment to play this idea with other people and do it in situations where you should be doing something else, is basically the idea. So when you're eating food, you shouldn't be juggling, right? So that's a good moment. Or if you're, any other moment you find that it's not really the moment to juggle, that's the moment you should be trying to play this game. Okay? That's your homework.